Law matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better place to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide information and resources to help you decide whether you need or want to contact a lawyer. Perhaps we'll help you to determine that you in fact can handle some issues yourself. If you do need additional professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, and as a result, so will the professional you select. Either way, our goal, of course, is to help save you time, money, and to achieve the best possible results. We want to once again welcome and thank David Bazar from Bazar and Associates Law Firm in East Providence. They help us with each session. So here we go. Today, elder abuse and fraud, ripped from the headlines that have been going all summer long, and it's also a national problem. It's serious, it's largely underreported, and mainly unprosecuted. It's family and friends, it's caregivers in the homes, in institutions, and sometimes even court-appointed guardians. Approximately 1 in 10 Americans aged 60 plus have experienced some form of abuse. Some estimates, as I read it, range as high as 5 million a year. The effects are astonishing. National reports are that elders who have been abused are at 300% higher risk of death because of these things. And while they're likely underreported, some of that elder abuse and fraud costs Americans upwards to $36 billion annually. And while there's financial exploitation, there is also emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect that goes on. So knowing that attacks are on the rise, we figured we should tackle this topic today. There are no guidelines for charging elders offenders in Rhode Island or Massachusetts. Many barriers to prosecution leave so many victims at risk. So we're going to discuss what you can and should know and what you can and should do. So it's friends and it's family. These people can commit financial fraud. What should we be aware of? What should we be on the lookout for from your perspective, David?
Well, as you said, this can take many different forms, but from the financial aspect, one of the best things you can do is, while you're still competent and able to plan, you should put a plan in place that protects you as you become older, so that you have the people who you most trust to take care of. And even, it's never 100% foolproof, you don't know. But if you're making decisions while you're competent and able to do so, putting the best plan in place that protects you financially and have the people in place to manage that plan for you is the best way you can go, so that you can avoid a guardianship and probate and avoid other people stepping in that you don't want involved and taking care of you and your money.
So often we hear about how scammers prey on trust and fear. And we've talked about how you should be aware of those, or an elder or anyone should be aware of those things. But even if you've put a plan in place that seems to make sense, you've put someone who's reliable, next of kin, in trust of your financials and everything else, and then things change, their situation changes, and at times they, as we've read, have become the perpetrators. Even if you have something in place, how should you, as other family members or even friends or neighbors, what can you and should you look out for, and what should you do, David?
So depending on how much assets we're talking about, there are a number of different ways of protecting your assets and you as you get older. Trusts, we've talked about before, and preparing trusts and having trusts in place, powers of attorney for people to be able to do things for you. What we often see people do is, if they don't have a trust but they want to use the power of attorney, for instance, to provide for healthcare decisions under the healthcare power of attorney, or in Massachusetts, healthcare proxy, or durable power of attorney for financial decisions and that type of thing. Often one spouse appoints the other and vice versa, and then they'll appoint somebody else to help if the spouse isn't available. What happens is, you're hoping when you do that, that person that you appoint will be responsible and able to do the things that you want them to do. If there's more than one person that you could choose to protect yourself, it might not be a bad idea to make 2 people do it and have them act jointly. It's more work. It's not something that a lot of people do often, but if there's any question in your mind that, well, I trust my daughter or my son right now, but the situation could change, or my friend or whoever it is that you selected, it might be good to have another set of eyes looking over what's going on at the same time.
And if someone didn't have these instruments in place, but somehow someone begins to forge an elderly person's signature or cash checks without permission, or maybe even get a credit card to do their grocery shopping, and then they have a little on the side that they take for themselves. Not always can you, if you're a friend or a neighbor, not necessarily would you notice it, but if you do start to see that someone's getting nervous about money, or you happen to see that some signs that there's some problem along the way. If you are a family member, what do you do first?
Well, it depends on the mental capacity of the person you're concerned about, whether it's your parent or some elderly friend or whoever it might be. If they do have their mental capacity about them, I would start by raising the issue with them. I notice that you're more worried about money. Is there something going on? Or I see that you've been, say, driving, so-and-so has been driving you to the bank an awful lot lately. What's going on? Is everything okay? And if they're competent and they have some concern, they might share it with you, they might not. There are other agencies and places you can report concerns to. The Department of Elderly Affairs in Rhode Island has a hotline, I believe, or a number you can call, and they can help. You can give them the concern, and they can send people out who can look into things.
Suppose you just happen to be a caring, and say a legitimately caring, straight neighbor who just wants to check in, and then you start to see that that elderly person is acting differently. Well, maybe just that they're in decline, but maybe not. What can you do if you legally and reasonably, if you're just a neighbor and you want to make sure that there isn't something that's going on and you have some suspicions? What do you do? Well,
again, depending on the mental capacity, start with the person.
Right.
If you're not going to get anywhere with that because they have declined, you know, and there's family that you want to speak to, maybe speak to someone in the family and get some information to them that they may not know about and feedback from them. And again, if that doesn't work, bring the state into it if you have to.
And what about if it's not a family member, but say there is an elderly person living at home and they have the caretaker? Now it's not the family member who's committing the financial fraud. That then becomes a different issue entirely.
That's
if
right.
You're the family member, do you call the police? If you're the neighbor, do you call the police? How does that play out, and how is that different?
I think you have to know what role you have and what you can play. If you have power of attorney and you have a caretaker there and you're not happy with something that's going on and you're in a position to fire them, fire them. If you're not in that position and you still have some concerns, and there are other family members who may have that power to do that, raise it with them. And then if you don't get anywhere and you have reasonable suspicion and you're pretty sure you know what's going on and it's wrong, report it to the police if you have to.
Okay. I also read, not just in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and several other states, there have been reports now of the one who has been appointed the guardian. So explain the guardian and the conservatorship, such as it is. How does that work?
Those are two different types of probate procedures that are involved when you're still alive, you're here, but you're not with us, really mentally, in some way or another. And guardianships are designed today to be as limited as they can be, but still get the job done. So there are a number of areas that are of concern for the probate court when somebody is being petitioned to be appointed a guardian for someone. And there are a number of different areas a guardian can serve in. The one area that we usually see is in financial affairs and making sure that their money is being spent for them and used properly, but also making residential decisions, which can include whether or not someone needs to be in a nursing home relationship type decisions, who they're going to be involved with, health decisions, what medical care they need to have, and those types of things. So someone may need, for example, help in deciding financially how their bills are going to get paid and where they're going to live, but they might be able to make medical decisions, for example. So you don't take away that person's right or power to make their own decisions in that area.
Sure.
So you limit the power of attorney, the guardian's role in that way, if you can. The court's always looking for the least intrusive way of dealing with the ward or the person who's going to be under the guardianship's way of being dealt with. So if there's a power of attorney already in place, you might not even need the guardianship to begin with. A conservatorship is when you need to get someone in to get their arms around what assets there are, because the person may not know what they have and where it is, and you need them to gather everything up to save it and keep it safe.
So if we've been reading that it has become the guardian, him or herself, who's the perpetrator, in the sense that judges or advocates, they often say that it's difficult to know whether or not there's been abuse, and it's largely tied, as I understand it, to what they've charged for providing the service. So you're a lawyer, you understand that you have to account for your hours, but honestly, from the judge's perspective, he may not know if it took 1 versus 4 hours to have thus and such. I mean, if it was outrageous, maybe or glaringly obvious, that's one thing. But for the number of hours that someone perhaps did not truthfully serve, there's, I guess, a lot of bilking going on there. What's to be done about that?
So I guess there are two issues. Overcharging is one that you're raising.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so the good news for the ward in that situation is the judge is the last line of defense, and we'll know if someone comes in with a $20,000 bill for something that they've seen the judge, that is, time and time again, that should be a $5,000 bill. They'll ask questions and make sure before that's approved, if it's approved. The other concern is just the person who's going to take the ward's money and use it for themselves, and that's happened. And again, there's some court oversight and control, and you file an inventory. You're supposed to lay out what there is. That has to be done correctly for this all to work. And then you do an accounting each year of what you've spent, what's come in, and what you've spent. And there is a way of the court having some oversight and tracking of what the person's doing, but unscrupulous people will do what unscrupulous people will do.
So if you have a guardian, who can check in on the guardian before it goes to the judge or advocate?
Well, it's the court, really.
It is.
That will be the one once the guardianship's in place. But if you're a family member and you see things going on and you're not so sure that they're correct, you can bring those to the court's attention.
So it would presume then that perhaps even though there's a court-appointed guardian, that perhaps one of the family members might still be looking at that checkbook and suddenly sees $5,000 went south. And when, in this case, one case, when the guardian was asked, oh, that person wanted me to invest in a CD or something, right, and didn't want anyone else to know about it. Well, in fact, that wasn't the case at all. It was for himself or herself, and there was something underhanded going on. So it seems that there might be a good reason these days, if these kinds of things happen, that you need to have someone checking in on that in addition to the court, if the court seems to admit that it's sometimes difficult for them to know what every single line item of approved, right, charges might be.
The family needs to stay involved even if there's a guardian, and this sometimes becomes an issue. Of course, the guardian could be one child, but there are other children who are concerned about what's going on, and if it's a good family relationship, they should be able to have an open and honest conversation with the guardian. What does mom or dad need? What are we getting them? How much money does mom and dad have? Is there enough for us to do everything they do? Why are there 3 withdrawals at Foxwoods? Did mom really want to go to the ATM at Foxwoods? So it's not a bad idea for other family members to stay involved.
Okay, and in the case where we know that strangers ask for money very often. Some people are very circumspect about that. You know, I want to check what this charity is, if it's legitimate. But sometimes older people, in losing some cognitive faculties, they tend to be likely to just pass out that money. And okay, maybe sometimes it's all right, but how, if you are nothing but the neighbor, do you get to stay on top of these kinds of things when you see someone who's ringing the doorbell all the time?
Yeah, I mean, that's not an easy situation. What a helpful friend, neighbor, relative could do is have regular conversations with the person and say, what have you been doing, what are you up to? And maybe try to get them to agree not to make any gifts or do anything without having a conversation first, so that you can help them. Just say, you know, I just want to make sure no one tries to take advantage of you, so why don't you talk to me about those things before you do them. They may or they may not. You know, sometimes when you get older, you may get a little paranoid and think they're asking you for the wrong reasons. So the best you can do is just be alert and involved.
So we're starting to talk about this in a way that includes not the family member, because there may be a problem that's beginning or budding and you'd like to help avoid that person, help to prevent that person from being taken advantage of. They say that it's not a bad idea for you, if you are a neighbor, a concerned neighbor, a friend, you stop in at different times of the day or call more frequently at different times of the day, and listen more carefully perhaps than you ever had before if you think that some of these kinds of things are going on. But if in fact we go back to the situation of the family member being the problem, whether it's financial or physical or whatever, so much of what's been reported of late is because it's not been reported of late.
Right.
And there's no way for them to prosecute what is not known. And the senior, for not wanting to keep the son or the daughter from coming to visit, or where would I go, how do you, as a lawyer, on the one hand, if you have a client, let's deal with it that way, and then if you're just trying to advise some of our viewers and listeners.
Right. So those are difficult situations, and many times an older couple will come to see me, and one of the parties may be starting to fail a little bit, the husband or the wife. Let's make it the husband. And I've had cases where the children have come with the parents, and I'd like to assess the whole situation as what's the family dynamics, how do all these people get along, but then talk to whoever it is that's my client, if it's the parents or one parent alone, and just make sure I'm hearing the same thing from them when they're not in the presence of their children or one child or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And what we try to do is create a plan. And again, I go back to planning is the best safeguard against the abuse that may happen later, is who is the best person in the family that can make sure that your health decisions are made. And let's have more than one. And oftentimes, if there are several children, we put in that the children will discuss it if they have to amongst themselves before a decision's made. Who's the best person with money? Who's going to have your needs at heart best? Who's going to be the one to make other decisions for you best, and just have that laid out. And like I said, oftentimes if there's any concern, you don't want to have just one person, and maybe you separate the roles out. So one child is making decisions about your health while another one's making decisions about your money, but they have to work together. And you set it up so that can they work together, number one, but that they are there so they're able to look over what each other one's doing, so there is some safeguard in place.
Ultimately, one has to have the final say, though, when that arrangement's made.
You do set it up that way. So one has the ultimate decision perhaps in one area and the other in another area, and the doctor only wants to talk to one person. He doesn't want to talk to a team of family members. Right. But you maybe encourage and plan out early on how you're going to work together, and that's what we do when we bring the family in together. And Oftentimes we talk about estate planning as a dress rehearsal for the death, but it's also a dress rehearsal for when someone declines and is no longer able to take care of their own affairs.
Okay, and in the situation, David, where it's not a client where you have that conversation, the estate plan, the will, and all the rest, but you still want to help, and here's a situation where you see some trouble starting to happen, and you don't really want to meddle, but maybe someone's being exploited. Right. So is it a matter of, let's call DEA? Would I be in trouble if I call DEA? There's an issue about mandatory reporting, permissive, voluntary reporting. Should you? When should you?
Yeah, well, I think if you have reasonable concerns, you should. It's a little bit different in some ways than we've had cases that we talked about before where there's mandatory reporting to DCYF for children that are suspected abuse, teachers, doctors, that type of thing, where they have to call if they suspect child abuse. In this situation, you have that available to you. You're not going to get in trouble for calling, especially if you have reasonable concern. And that's their job, to come out and take a look at it and see what can be done to help protect an older person.
Let's help encourage viewers to be more in tune. If you think that there is potential abuse and you want to place that call, what information do you have to give other than the suspected abused person's name and address and situation? Do you have to tell them who you are? They might need to follow up with a call. What else do you have to say?
I would. I would tell them who you are, what your relationship is to the person who you're concerned about, who you think might be creating the issues, and what it is that you think that they're doing and why you think they're doing it. So I would give them as much information as you can so that they have that information to work with. Good.
And if you don't report and you are one of the doctors, lawyers, accountants, you're supposed to have some mandatory accountability, from what I understand. In some states, people need to look that up to see who does, but $1,000 has been a known fine for those who were close to the situation and had some fiduciary responsibility to make sure something bad wasn't happening and didn't report. So please do.
Right, and whether it's legally required or not, I think ethically, if there are some real concerns, again, if you can dig in and try to get it resolved without having to report it to anybody, try to do that. But if there's no way that's going to happen, and if it's criminal, then these things have to be dealt with. And if it's just very concerning and it's something that you think the State Department of Elderly Affairs needs to be aware of because there's no other way of getting this fixed, report it.
And this is true also not just of financial exploitation, but physical abuse, sexual abuse too, correct?
Yep.
Now, if someone's sitting in front of you and you are their attorney, you're in a situation where you can, and probably do, dispense information, including how to maybe help that senior to be aware that he not become exploited, or if he is, not to be embarrassed about speaking up. You have those things as option if you get to see it.
Right, and depending on the mental capacity of the client or the person, that's what I was saying. I'll have that conversation privately with them so that they're not embarrassed to tell me what needs to be done and how I can help them. If it's something I can't do, but I can help get it reported to where it needs to go. So I think it's and that having a relationship with a client over a period of time helps build the trust up. So maybe if you get that opportunity as the attorney, you'll be in a position to get them to tell you what it is you think is going on and have them tell you what they think is going on.
So continue that conversation for a moment, David, because here you're talking about you being a lawyer and in that capacity. So for viewers who watch, for those of us who want to do what is maybe not a legal issue for us, but certainly because it's the right conscientious thing to do, what should you do, what can you do in talking to that senior to help take down that defense that because they might not want to or they're embarrassed to admit that they're being harassed, exploited, or
Yeah.
something in between.
Well, I think it's all about relationships, and having had a relationship with that person for a period of time is something that you can draw on and get some level of trust and comfort with them so that they're willing to talk to you. Again, it depends on where they are in their life and their stage of and their mental capacity. So sometimes people just aren't able to have those conversations.
Able, willing, and if they are able, still many are unwilling, embarrassed, as we talked about, the blockades, the embarrassment, the concern that they're going to be left alone, or if I don't have that person, my cousin, my sister, my niece, nephew, son, coming to help me, then what will happen to me? I won't be able to stay in my home.
Right.
I'll be ripped away from the things that I know and love. How do you offset that?
Well, if they're able
they're
to have the conversation, then you have to get them to become willing to have the conversation. And then there's a lot of assurances that you can give to someone once you start peeling away the layers of what the concerns are. You know, and sometimes people that you think are being exploited are more than perfectly fine knowing exactly what's going on and saying, no, I'm giving them permission to do this. This is part of what I've agreed to. And they know what they're doing. And if that's the situation, then you get there. But if you're peeling back and you can see that there's some undue influence taking place and that's not really their free will that's doing it, but it's the influence that's being exerted on them, you have to try to get them to help understand that there are alternatives.
From what I've researched, that's a very key point and a very good example that you bring up, because the first line of defense often is, well, it's really a loan. It was a gift. I meant to give them this and continue to give them that.
Right.
But in fact, there are stories behind the stories, which, as they say, often don't get.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
and heaven forbid, if this is uncovered, my son, daughter, niece, nephew will go to jail. Do they? What are considered misdemeanors? What are full-fledged felonies?
Well,
where does this come
it's really
down?
based on how much money is involved. So if you've fleeced an elderly person out of, it depends on the state, but a certain amount of money, that becomes a felony as opposed to a misdemeanor. And it is a crime. Now, the victim, if they're in their right mind, has the right to decide whether or not they're going to prosecute that crime, but they certainly have the right to determine that a crime has been committed, and I don't want my niece to go to jail, but I don't want her to be involved in my care in financial affairs anymore.
So they do have a right to say, I don't want to prosecute, I just don't want them to be writing my checks anymore, correct?
Right.
So comment in the short amount of time that we have left, if there is enough evidence that says clearly someone has committed fraud, sexual exploitation, and there's this evidence, should the law be able to prosecute that person despite what the senior says? Should they be able to do
If
that?
there's evidence that this has happened, then you absolutely can. It's not unlike those situations where there's domestic violence and domestic abuse and the abused victim says, I don't want to press the charges, but the state has other evidence and can go forward without their testimony.
Good to know. We hope that this has been helpful to you. We've listed the elderly abuse hotlines for Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Stay tuned to the Law Matters because, of course, it matters to you. Thank you.